Hello and welcome to GameSack. It's time to finish up my series on the Castlevania games. So far I've covered the 8-bit games, the 16-bit games, and the Metroidvania games. Not necessarily in that order, but you get the idea. Anyway, this episode focuses on the rest of them. Many of them are 3D, but surprisingly not all of them. Oh, and I won't be covering the phone games or the pachinko games or the weird 2009 arcade game, mainly because I have no way to play them, much less record video from them. Well, actually, I can do one phone game. Anyway, with that said, let's get going, and I'll be taking a look at them in the order they were released. Here's Castlevania from Konami. It's on the Nintendo 64. That's right, it's not called Castlevania 64, just Castlevania. Konami actually thought this game was good and or important enough to supplant the original. Don't you hate it when publishers and movie studios do that? Such hubris. It rarely ever turns out well either. Anyway, this game was released in early 1999. As you can see, this is the first 3D game for the series. It starts off okay and almost kind of promising. You play as Reinhard Schneider or Carrie Fernandez taking care of Dracula as the Belmonts do every 100 years or so. The Belmonts are absolutely sick of doing that though, so it's time for the Schneiders and the Fernandezes of the world to stand up to the challenge. The control is okay, though it requires use of a lock-on to target and hit your enemies. The lock-on is generally automatic for the most part, fortunately. Sadly, when enemies or candles drop items, the game requires you to press a dedicated button to pick them up. Why? Why can't I just run through them and automatically collect them like every other game ever made? Who sat down and thought, you know, the player would really enjoy it more if they had to manually collect each item with the press of a button? As you can guess, the camera is a major problem with this game. There are 3 different camera modes: normal, action, and battle. They all suck, but I found the action one to be the least sucky, but only by a little bit. Oftentimes the camera is forced and you can't switch it, like when fighting a boss. I love how far the camera puts me away from my dude as I try to whip these things breathing blue fire on me. Platforming is also often an issue. Here, you're supposed to climb down these platforms, jump across the river, and then climb up the platforms on the other side. I died here. And when I say that, I mean I died a lot. Fortunately, there's a save point pretty close. You spend the first part of the game outside looking for switches to open gates. Super fun stuff, as you can imagine. When you get inside, it gets a little better. There are scrolls to find in some areas, and these will summon the shop. I suggest buying lots of healing items if you can afford them. There's also a day and night mechanic where some characters won't show up if it's not the right time. You can collect certain cars to adjust the time if you want to. If you take longer than 16 in-game days to play through the game, you'll get the bad ending. So don't take time and smell the roses, you gotta rush, rush, rush! Not like you want to spend very long playing this one anyway. You only get 1 life before a game over, so be sure to save everywhere you can. I found myself trying again and again despite the overall clumsy design, so at least that says a little something positive about this title. While it does feature some Castlevania staples here and there, the game reminds me way more of Silent Hill, and not a good Silent Hill. The graphics are okay for the system and are pretty much what you'd expect. The music is pretty good when it plays, but it often doesn't. The sound quality of everything is pretty good for a cartridge game.
And soon, the land will again be plunged into darkness.
So, is this game as bad as everyone says? No, there's actually some enjoyment to be had here. Is it a good game? Also no, especially if you have other games that you could be playing instead. Castlevania Legacy of Darkness is also for the Nintendo 64. This was also released in 1999, but at the end of the year. This is more of an expansion pack / DLC for the first game rather than a proper sequel. You basically run around the same areas. You even fight the same bosses. There are some new places to explore though. The controls are also the same. You play as Cornell, who can transform into a werewolf. This takes place 8 years before the other N64 game that I just talked about. You're off to rescue your sister Ada from the clutches of evil. She is to be sacrificed to awaken Dracula. This game takes advantage of the expansion pack, giving you the choice of low or high resolution. I recommend choosing the low resolution, I'm serious. The game runs faster and feels more responsive than the previous game. If you choose the high resolution mode, the edges of the polygons are a little sharper, but the game runs at a nearly unplayable frame rate. Very ugly. It's seriously not worth it. There have been a few improvements besides the game's overall speed. While the camera is still pretty bad, they have made things a little bit better here and there. Like when you're fighting this boss, you don't feel like you're as far away and it's much easier to deal with. There's also more music instead of just ambient noise in a lot of places. The game itself feels much easier than the previous entry. I don't recommend this game unless you enjoyed the first. It's certainly not worth the full price. However, if you want a Castlevania game for your Nintendo 64 and you're only going to get one of them, get this one. Overall, this still doesn't feel like a Castlevania game, especially since you don't get to play as a character who uses a whip. At least not right away. Once you beat it with the first two characters, you can more or less unlock the first game, though it's slightly abridged with some missing voice and cutscenes due to this being a cartridge game. Oh well. While the portable systems would continue to get 2D games, the main big boy platforms would only get 3D games for a while. But how would much more powerful hardware like, say, the PlayStation 2 affect things? I don't know. Let's find out. 4 years after the release of the N64 games, we got Castlevania Lament of Innocence on the PlayStation 2. You play as Leon Belmont, and chronologically, this game takes place before any of the other Castlevania games. An evil vampire has kidnapped your girl, and you're off to rescue her. Suffice it to say, you're gonna give Dracula the first major ass-whipping of his immortal life. Or will you? Yeah, that's what you'd think, but don't get your hopes up. The game is much better than the titles on the Nintendo 64. It takes place mostly indoors now, which honestly is fine by me. That means the camera is less likely to wander and you don't need to worry about the different camera types. It's still far from perfect, but overall it's much better. The control is also certainly better than the Nintendo 64 games. Leon feels fluid for the most part, though his jump can be a little weird. You already have a double jump at your disposal right from the start. The game wants you to parry a lot of attacks with the guard button when things glow purple. I never really got into this much, but it doesn't bring the game down at all. You can also bounce across horizontal poles with your whip, which is super weird. It usually works okay, except when the poles are moving. It's really tough to judge exactly where they are, and it's easy to miss them. This does detract from my enjoyment of the game a little, but I don't think it would be an issue if the game were 2D. Just saying. You're still running from place to place finding switches that will open doors that you need to get through. Some of the rooms will trap you in until you defeat all of the enemies inside. Once they're defeated, if you enter that room again, the enemies will all reappear, but you don't need to fight them again if you don't want to. The rooms are all connected with long, boring halls, and there are a ton of them. Most of them look the same. There is some backtracking, but I wouldn't quite call it a Metroidvania. The main castle entrance serves as a hub where you can access the 5 different areas. You collect items to upgrade and extend your abilities in life, but you don't gain experience in advanced levels like you do in Symphony of the Night. I guess that makes it easier to avoid fighting enemies if killing them isn't going to do much for me. You do have a shop where you can buy random stuff.
Is this okay?
Each area of the castle is giant, and viewing the map can seem a little weird at first since this is a 3D game, but you'll get used to it. The visuals aren't bad for the PlayStation 2, though I don't think much here is going to blow you away. Unfortunately, the game only runs in interlaced mode. I'm forcing it into 480p here via GSM running on my PS2, and it looks incredible that way. Sadly, that means the full motion videos won't play, so you have to skip them. I hope someday that the GSM guys can fix that. The music, on the other hand, is extremely good, and that is no surprise at all. It was handled by Michiru Yamane, who is responsible for Rocket Knight Adventures. Oh, and Symphony of the Night, as well as Bloodlines. Overall, I think this is an enjoyable adventure. I still prefer the 2D games, but at least they made a good Castlevania game that works well in 3D. Castlevania Curse of Darkness was released for the PlayStation 2 and Xbox in 2005. This is the first game in the series to be multi-platform at launch. I'm playing on the PlayStation 2 here, and I'll explain why this is my preferred version in just a bit. Here, you play as a devil forger named Hector who is decidedly not a Belmont, and it takes place 3 years after Castlevania 3. You're after some dude who killed your woman. If you've seen the Castlevania animated series, this is the same Hector. First of all, I've got to say that this game feels much snappier as far as the camera is concerned. It's not fixed like the one in Lament of Innocence was. You now have pretty much full control over the camera with the right analog stick. That's not to say the camera is perfect, because it can still get pretty messed up, especially during some boss fights. Hector also feels a touch more fluid in his attacks and other moves. Since he's not a Belmont, he doesn't use a whip and can equip different weapons throughout his quest. In fact, it's set up very similar to Symphony of the Night in this regard. And yes, this time you also level up. Hector pushes forward each time he attacks. I'm not sure why some games do this, but I really wish they wouldn't. Unfortunately, like a lot of games in this era, you can get stuck in an animation if you press a button too many times. You have to wait for Hector to stop doing whatever he's doing before the control is returned to you. Let it be known that this is a feature that I do not enjoy. This wasn't as much of an issue in Lament of Innocence. You have familiars, which this game calls IDs. They can help you do things like open treasure chests, heal you, or fight with you. They can be leveled up as well. And of course, there's a shop to buy stuff at. You can obtain or buy tickets that will let you warp back to the shop, or a save point that you've registered as a point to return to previously. The areas are super big, and it can take Hector a while to get around them. In fact, I think they might be a touch too big, as many of the areas feel pretty empty. The game uses the same map system as found in Lament of Innocence, but I found myself looking at it more here. That's probably because it's easy to get turned around due to the non-fixed camera. The graphics are once again pretty good. The PS2 version only offers 480i, but the Xbox version can run it in 480p. However, the Xbox version is seriously messed up. First of all, the game is a lot darker. I've actually noticed this on a lot of Xbox games. I'm not sure why so many games on this platform tend to be so dark. Not only that, but the text is pretty jaggy and messy looking compared to the PS2 version. If that's not enough, the entire game has glitched visuals at the bottom and the top of the screen. It doesn't matter if you change the settings on your Xbox, they're always there. Granted, back in the days of CRTs and early LCDs, this would have been drawn to the overscan area. But these days, it's pretty ugly. Forcing the PS2 version into 480p with GSM results in a much sharper, brighter, and better image. In fact, it blows the Xbox version away, which is really quite surprising. The full motion videos even tended to work pretty well in this game when it's forced to 480p. But this one crashed on me as it ended. Can't win them all, I guess. Once again, the music by Michiru Yamane is fantastic. In fact, I think it's even a bit better than the stuff in Lament of Innocence. Overall, this is another really good game, and I think I like it a bit more than Lament of Innocence. It's not perfect by any means, but it's definitely enjoyable. Here's Castlevania Judgment, which was released in 2008 exclusively for the Wii. This one was developed by Aiding, which was formed from lots of ex-Compile staff. And, well, it's a fighting game, just what the Castlevania franchise needs. In concept, it's not a bad idea, but in practice this game just doesn't work very well. It wants to play like a one-on-one fighting game, but the main issue is the camera. Fighting games, even 3D ones, need to keep the action on a 2D plane. In this game, the camera goes all over the place, and sometimes the enemy is even standing between you and the camera. It's bad. The good news though is that at least you can use the GameCube controller. Lots of characters that you know from throughout the series are here, which is what you'd expect. But why is Grant from Castlevania 3 now like Voldo from Soul Calibur? Like seriously, what the actual hell? I want answers. Camilla is like Ivy, but at least that somewhat makes sense. Anyway, as you can fight, you can toss out sub-weapons and even change them by picking up items. You can also increase the rate at which you toss them by picking up the number boxes. They honestly don't help that much. What does help is your super special move, which takes off way more than half of your opponent's total life. You want to know how to do that special move? Press a single button. That's it. Most of the time you'll be attacking empty air as you wait for your animations to finish. Also, the guard button doesn't seem very effective at all. There's a story mode where you go from opponent to opponent with only 1 round each. The arcade mode is pretty standard and it needs you to win 2 rounds to advance. Then there's the castle mode. Here you go from room to room accomplishing stupid things, like defeating all of the enemies or collecting some hearts or whatever. Then you move on, but you can only save after some rooms. The graphics are pretty nice for the console, and the music features lots of cool arrangements of familiar tunes, so that's definitely a plus. It doesn't save the gameplay though, as it's not refined at all. I can't really recommend it unless you're just trying to collect as many Castlevania games as you can. We'd get a brief respite from the 3D games during the Wii's era. That's right, I'm going to cover a 2D game. Actually, I've got 3 different 2D games to show you in this episode. In 2009, we saw a return to 2D with Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth for the Wii. This digital-only title via Nintendo's WiiWare was developed by M2, makers of the world-renowned Gauntlet 4 on the mighty 16-bit Sega Genesis console. You play as Christopher Belmont in this remake of the original Game Boy Castlevania game, and you can use the GameCube controller to do it too. And by remake, I mean remake, as it bears very little resemblance to that game. There's the rolling eyeballs and maybe a couple of other small things like the way your whip powers up, but that's pretty much it. When the whip is at full power, it can shoot a projectile, which is fun to use, but its use is limited. This is old school Castlevania for the most part. You can only whip horizontally, you don't have a dedicated button for your subweapon, and things of that nature. The difficulty isn't as brutal as the original games, but it's not a walk in the park either. There are 6 levels, and there are multiple paths through each, so there's definitely some replayability. Even if there weren't multiple paths, you'd still want to play this game again and again because it's excellent. The graphics are really nice and went for the retro look before it started becoming super popular. It basically looks like a nice 32-bit 2D game running in 240p with lots of scaling and especially rotation, except that this game won't output in 240p. In fact, if you want the sharpest image from your console, be sure to set the system to 4:3 output in the system settings. If you do, your image will be decently sharp, like this. If you leave it set to 16:9, you actually lose horizontal resolution, so the image becomes ultra soft, like this. Gross. I don't know about you, but I'd rather it look like this. The music is amazing as well, and it goes for that FM style sound with lots of samples thrown in for good measure. The large majority of it is arrangements from previous games, but when it's this fun to listen to, I don't care. Overall, this is a fantastic game, and it was great to see the series return to 2D, even if only briefly. Unfortunately, the Wii Shop is no longer in operation. This game was never released physically, at least as of the making of this episode. As a result, it's now impossible to buy this game. There is always hope for the future, though. Castlevania Harmony of Despair was released digitally on the Xbox 360 in 2010 and on the PS3 in 2011. I'm playing this on the Xbox 360. This is another 2D game, but it's decidedly different. You're basically on a single huge map running around trying to make it to the boss area. You can view the entire thing at once and everything is super tiny. I mean, look at that. You can zoom it in a little so you can see some actual detail, but everything is still really small. Or you can zoom it in all the way. The stage is a giant labyrinth, and you have to run back and forth and unlock a few things to progress. Everything feels like it moves extremely slowly. Granted, it doesn't help that the Xbox 360 has one of the worst D-pads ever to exist in the history of ever. Using the analog stick is definitely more responsive, but it just doesn't feel right to use an analog stick for a 2D game. Still, that's how I recommend you play this one. The most difficult part of the game is actually finding the boss. Sure, you can see them on the map, but getting there is a mission unto itself. Oh, and you can't pause the game and you have a limited amount of time. There are these things scattered about, and this is the only place where you can manage your items. Here, you can equip new clothes and weapons to make yourself a little tougher. You can also equip a potion, but only one at a time. Once you use it, another doesn't automatically take its place even if you have multiple. Even when you use a high potion, it really doesn't restore much life. Suffice it to say, these item managing stations are few and far between. Once you finally do make it to the boss, you'll be thrilled to discover that they don't have a life bar at all, which only adds to the fun. Of course, I'm being a smartass. Every boss should always have a life bar. Still, I hope you're ready because the bosses do not go down easily. Even if you die, you keep the money and the items that you collected. You can buy new stuff in the shop before you start the game and then equip it right as the game begins. Graphically, it looks pretty nice in 1080p, though almost all of the assets have been reused from previously existing games in the series. The music is awesome as well, and it's rearranged from older games, which is fine, but you'll spend so much time wandering around the stages that it might grow tiresome after too long. The game is probably better with online multiplayer. As a single-player game, it's alright. The Xbox 360 version offers online multiplayer, whereas the PlayStation 3 version has local co-op. Overall, this one is interesting, but not particularly amazing. Castlevania was completely rebooted in 2013 as Castlevania Lords of Shadow for the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and PC. The PS3 was the lead platform during development, and that's the version I'm playing here. Konami wanted to reboot the franchise without Koji Igarashi's involvement, and this game from Mercury Steam was the one that won out during development. Hideo Kojima even helped with a few pieces of advice. You play as Gabriel Belmont in a game that feels like anything except Castlevania. You'll hardly find any Castlevania-ness in this game's world and story until the very end. And even then it's like, what? You do have a whip, and you are named Belmont, but I've got to be honest, I may have had more fun with the Nintendo 64 games than this. This one comes from an era where games desperately wanted to be cinematic more than anything else. It plays like a combination between God of War and Uncharted, with more emphasis on the God of War, except that it doesn't do either of those concepts very well. Like so many games of the time, you can get stuck in attacking animations, which makes the game feel extremely laggy. To its credit, the game offers a variety of different environments and playstyles, like attacking enemies riding on the back of a magic horse who appears out of nowhere for no reason whatsoever. Oh, and there are QuickTime events, but these are not done well. For example, some bosses require finishing moves for no other reason than to toot their cinematic horn like God of War so often does. You have to time some button press, usually R2, with these moving circles and then press the indicated button. And that's what I do. But practically every time I mistimed it and had to redo the entire fight. I can't tell you how annoying this is, and finally getting it right after so many fights was not satisfying at all. Graphically, it's not horrible for a PlayStation 3 game. The frame rate isn't impressive, but it's normal for a game from this era on this console. The music fits the action, I suppose, but it doesn't do anything to stand out against the countless other games with full orchestras more concerned with cinematic action than anything. So yeah, it's not extremely memorable. If it weren't for the QuickTime events, or if the QuickTime events were competently designed, this could have been a really good game, just not a Castlevania game. Whoever decided QuickTime events should be included single-handedly ruined this game. Well, we can kind of see how the series is starting to go downhill now. However, the second game in the Lord of Shadow series is more of a 2D game than the first one. Will that help things out? Again, I don't know. Let's find out together. Castlevania Lords of Shadow Mira Fate was released on the 3DS, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3 in 2013, and on the PC in 2014. The 3DS versions came first, and of course the other versions are called HD to signify that their visuals suck a tiny bit less. You start out by playing as Gabriel in the tutorial, which takes place before the first Lords of Shadow game. Then, you see him impregnate his wife with Trevor, who eventually fathers Simon. Gabriel didn't know about the pregnancy. Anyway, you start out playing as Simon, and of course he has a Scottish accent.
That's not enough. I need to see more.
The gameplay is now in 2.5D, and honestly it's a lot more interesting than the first game. Not that this game is very interesting, mind you. In fact, it's kind of bland. But hey, you still get to use a whip. You also eventually get to play as a couple of other characters that you may be familiar with. It's kind of Metroidvania-ish, so be on the lookout for the entrance to Brinstar, which is inside Dracula's castle. Haha, get it? Funny, right? No? Okay, moving on. The control is similar to the first Lords of Shadow with a heavy-handed use of the R2 button to do most things. And once again, you also need to block and dodge. You can get some magic powers like your mom, who protects you from enemies and falling souls. The gameplay isn't very fluid, but it feels normal for the era. Once again, you have the pushing forward as you attack. You gain experience and can level up, so that's cool. For some reason, there are purple scrolls that you can read that give you experience. I'm really not sure how the designers envision this adding anything to the game, as all it requires of you is pressing the R2 button. Visually, the game is bland, lacking color, and overall nondescript. Much like myself, in fact. Some of the enemies look kind of cool, though. The main character designs are definitely not something I'm a fan of. Simon looks way cooler in literally any other Castlevania game he's in. The music is once again trying to be super dramatic, and it's still not very memorable. But it can be cool and creepy when things are calm, like walking beneath these falling souls. Overall, I enjoyed this a lot more than the first, but I still got extremely bored with it after about an hour or so. Konami decided to continue this farce of a sub-series with Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2 in 2014 for the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and PC. You're still playing as Gabriel Belmont, who is now Dracula. The gameplay is similar to the first, but now you have different weapons you can switch to, like a sword to steal life from enemies and claws to bust through some tough armor and shields. The combat is still great magnitudes of suck, though. It relies heavily on blocking, and there are very few games with a block button that I enjoy, and this is not one of them. Again, like many games of this era, the controls don't feel fluid since the game has animations to process, which seems to take the priority. You can shapeshift into different things to get around, like a rat to get into various nooks and crannies, or a mist to pass through bars and whatnot. You can even briefly possess enemies if you need them to do something so you can make progress. It even adds a camera that you can actually control. It's okay, it's certainly not great, but I am happy that they give you some control. This game features a lot more exploration, and I kind of like that. I just don't like the combat, especially with the drawn-out boss fights. The QuickTime events are still here, and I still hate them. If the overall story wasn't already weird enough, it gets even weirder when you jump ahead 1,000 years to modern times. Visually, the game does have some nice splashes of color here and there, but on the whole, it's still very dark. Some of the enemies are gigantic, just like in God of War, but somehow seem far less impressive here. Sound-wise, it's similar to the last two games in this sub-series. The music usually tries to be overly dramatic or fairly calm, but always unmemorable. I really wish Konami hadn't gone this route with the series. If I wanted to play God of War, I'd just play God of War instead of this. Actually, screw that, I'd play Dante's Inferno.
Come back to us. Return to the castle.
Lastly, we have Castlevania Grimwire of Souls, which was released digitally for phones and Mac in September of 2021. This is a 2D game where you can play as a bunch of different characters in the series. It tries to keep everything stitched together with some kind of story, but I just didn't care. It really feels like a free-to-play game, as there's daily events and other nonsense that I don't understand and I simply can't be bothered to care about. I guess technically the genre of the game is called gacha, at least I think that's how it's pronounced. I honestly don't care, but I do know that I don't like it. You can play it if you subscribe to the Apple Arcade service, which is $5 a month. As a game, I mean, it certainly doesn't help that I'm playing with touchscreen controls, but even if I synced up a controller, I don't think I'd enjoy it that much more, as the gameplay itself just isn't appealing. You play through very short stages, defeating enemies and collecting things. This is another one where your character pushes themselves forward as you attack. What do developers think the appeal of this is? Some of the common enemies take way too many hits to defeat, but at least they have life bars. Finish a stage and get lots of rewards, which honestly aren't very good rewards unless you like things that are crap. Back at the hub screen, you can power up your weapons and do all sorts of nonsense. Normally this would be cool, but something about this game just made me not care at all. It's a bit too complex for its own good. Like I said, it feels like a free-to-play game with all this stuff designed to keep you glued to the screen. That may work for the kiddos, but not for old farts like me, and that's not something I'm exactly ashamed of. The graphics are a mixed bag. The 2D backgrounds look really nice. The 3D polygons used for the enemies and the characters, not so much. In fact, Simon looks hideous. He doesn't play very well either. The music is pretty good, and again, it's just rearrangements of older stuff. After I captured footage of this game, I immediately canceled my free trial for Apple Arcade so I wouldn't get charged $5. I've read that the non-Apple Arcade versions, there are microtransactions to make it even better, but, don't quote me on that. Or do, I don't care. All I know is that playing this game makes me feel dirty for some reason. I can't really quite explain it. Overall, this is not what I want to play, and it's not on any platform I want to play a Castlevania game on. There you go, that was all of the Castlevania games I'm physically capable of showing you. It is such a fantastic series, at least up until about 2008 or so when the last DS game came out, though I really do like the Rebirth game on the Wii as well. And no, I didn't talk about the compilations, they're nothing new, they're just compilations, so they don't count. Get your fingers off of that keyboard, unless you're going to compliment me. Actually, that's kind of a tall order, so complain away. Anyway, what do you think about the games I talked about in this episode, and what do you think about the Castlevania series as a whole? Let me know. In the meantime, thank you for watching GameSack. Man, I sure wish I was a Castlevania game. Me too. Same here. I mean, we try and try, but we'll just never be part of that amazing series. Oh look, the lowly imitators. We're real Castlevania games. It sure must suck to be you guys. Wait, what? I'm way more of a Castlevania game than either of you. So am I. Me too. I'm gonna have to agree with these guys. They're closer to the Castlevania series than you guys are. Well, go on, get. Hey now guys, that doesn't mean we're besties, so scram, okay? Okay.